I'm going to talk you through some sewing techniques now. And I'm going to start off by starting off. A question I get asked all the time by new sewers is, why does my top thread keep coming unthreaded? And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that your top thread tail isn't always long enough. So you want a nice long tail coming out the back of your behind your presser foot to get started off. So you want to have probably a good 5 inches, 3 to 5 inches just out the back. And the more confident you get, the shorter this can become. But it's largely because the thread isn't sitting behind the foot. The second thing to do, and this is really good practice, is before you start using your foot pedal to stitch, you want to make sure that you've done a full stitch using your balance wheel, and you want your needle down, and that will 9 times out of 10 sort out any thread issues. Another thing to talk about is the reverse stitch. So I briefly mentioned it, but I'm going to do an example of how to utilize that reverse stitch. So I'm going to now show you an example of how to utilize the reverse stitch. So I'm placing the fabric in the machine. Okay, I'm getting my tails up and behind my presser foot. I'm winding the first stitch on, keeping my needle in, and I'm going to do a couple of stitches forward. And then I'm going to press this reverse stitch button, and I'm going to go back a bit, and then I'm going to start sewing. And that there has locked in those stitches, which means that I can cut those tails right down, and that stitching line isn't going to go anywhere. So I'm going to talk about seam allowance here. So I'm not going to utilize this tool. However, if you wanted to, you could set your seam allowance at 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters and use this metal tool to guide you. So just to give you an illustration of what that might look like, I'm just going to press my foot down, and you'll see that I can run the edge of my fabric against that. So when I'm guiding, I'm not going to use this because I want to show you where you should be looking when you are sewing. So one thing that is really important is to not look at the needle when you're stitching. It's actually very few cases where you would be looking at the needle. Very specific types of stitches, like stitching in the ditch, where is a really good example where you would be looking exactly where your needle is going into the fabric. But actually what you should be doing is looking at the space around your presser foot and the fabric raw edge against any markings you've got on your base plate. So in this instance, I'm doing a 5/8 seam allowance. I've lined up the edge of my fabric with that 5/8 seam allowance, and I'm not looking at the needle. I'm looking about here. Do that reverse stitch. I'm looking at where this fabric edge is meeting that line. And what that does is give me a really neat, straight 5/8 seam allowance there. Another technique is, which is important to learn, is the art of pivoting. So I'm now going to show you how to do that. So pivoting is where you utilize the needle in its down position to be able to lift the presser foot and turn the fabric when you hit a very sharp bend, or if you need to do an angle, for example, if you're sewing a pocket. And I'll show you how to do that now. Okay, so I've preset my fabric. I'm going to run this to the edge. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my needle is all the way in. Okay, and then I'm going to lift the presser foot, I'm going to turn the fabric, and then I'm going to continue stitching. And what happens as a result is you end up with a continuous stitching line there. Final thing I want to talk about is sewing round bends. Bends are quite tricky to master and requires quite a lot of practice. It's a balancing act between controlling the fabric and moving it as you're stitching and not putting too much pressure on top of the fabric to stop it from moving at all. I tend to like to sew round bends actually just using my my left hand. It's my least dominant hand, and I feel I can get a much lighter touch to the fabric whilst controlling it. So if I just show you now what I mean. I'm just allowing the fabric to glide. Now I'm going to stop here because if I want to do a really sharp bend back on itself, I will need to lift my presser foot to assist me. And again, you can also use your pivoting technique to go around really sharp bends. And sometimes you may want to even just use your balance wheel to control the fabric instead. That there has created a rather interesting and weird teardrop shape.